History 101.
The original Resident Evil helped define the survival horror genre. As expected, fans eagerly anticipated the follow-up that took nearly 2 years and a complete revamp to come out. We've already covered the original version of Resident Evil 2, now dubbed Resident Evil 1.5 by the community, which you should definitely check out in the link below. The Resident Evil 2 that eventually released, however, took the series to a whole new level. There were still 2 protagonists, one male and one female, only this time instead of an elite group of soldiers, you were controlling Claire Redfield, sister of Chris Redfield from the first game, and a rookie cop on his first day named Leon Kennedy. Although a linear path, the opening section of the game featured streets of Raccoon City during the outbreak, making it feel as if there was nowhere safe. Most of the game still took place in the police station like originally intended, but the second half of the game expanded into the sewers and eventually a secret lab. In the original game you had slightly different paths and people assisting you depending on who your protagonist was. In Resident Evil 2 this expanded greatly with entire sections and items being in certain characters' campaigns. The second time through the game also gave a different scenario, Scenario B, that had a different intro, path through the station, encounters, enemies, and even a special superpowered enemy following after you by the name of Mr. X. Capcom would bring a version of him back for the third game as the benevolent Nemesis. This dual plotline and alternative scenarios greatly increased the interest in playing through the game and also contains some great unlockables for your efforts. Many consider Resident Evil 2 to be the best in the series, so it comes as no surprise that it was widely ported. In fact, Resident Evil 2 has 2 different releases on the PlayStation, a port to PC, a surprising port to the Nintendo 64, and even later ports to the Dreamcast and GameCube. This is in addition to a portable port on Tiger's short-lived Game.com. In this video we will take a look at these ports and examine each version's differences. Alright, without further ado, let's kick it off with the original release on the PlayStation in 1998. The first Resident Evil 2 was on the PlayStation 1. It was completed by a team of 40 to 50 people at Capcom Production Studio 4 and was just under a year late from its originally projected May 1997 release date. Despite the delay, this sequel delivered on every front. The massive game came in 2 discs, one for each protagonist, and in comparison to the original, the scope had been widened. Instead of a mansion, you were investigating a police station, albeit one that clearly took design tips from a museum. Upon leaving the police station, there was a sequence involving a parking garage and the sewers, with everything wrapping up in a secret underground lab. When you break it down, you can see how the formula and even locations from the first game are somewhat recreated, but it didn't matter much to me then, and it doesn't matter now. This is probably due to the fact that the comparison only holds on the first playthrough of the game with either character, known better to fans as Scenario A. Upon completing the game, you receive a somewhat vague ending, followed by save data that verifies your completion for the other character. You can then swap discs and play through the game a second time with the other protagonist, complete with a different route and plotline. Honestly, Scenario B isn't that drastically different from Scenario A, especially considering everything happens in the same locations. That said, there are some notable changes that start with your approach being a completely different route from the infamous street run from Scenario A. A handful of rooms will be accessible that weren't available before, and your protagonist will have a different NPC sidekick that relates to his or her story. Some boss battles, like the giant alligator fight, are removed to go along with the canon that your partner already dispatched of it. That's not to say Scenario B isn't harder, especially when you consider you'll be fighting the new enemy aptly named Mr. X. Mr. X is basically a prototype of Nemesis from the third game, which is an interesting challenge that I'm sure some who have never tried Scenario B even know exists. For the most part, you have to avoid him, but eager players or those that have unlocked infinite ammo are welcome to attack him until he falls to collect some random ammo he drops. Every time you encounter him, it's always in a narrow hallway or dead end, so the threat of death is always within reach during the inopportune times he drops in. Additionally, you will fight many more stages of Dr. William Birkin as he slowly transforms into the G-Virus monster that eventually concludes the endgame. By the time you get to the end of the lab, you are juggling both Burton and Mr. X, not to mention the final time showdown with the ultimate form of Birkin at the end. To be fair, it's not that difficult to fight, and I've even completed it while being in danger health, but the signature tension of Resident Evil is definitely present. Upon completing the Scenario B, you will receive a more complete ending that seems to suggest the third game will be about Claire finding her brother Chris. This makes sense considering that the original Resident Evil Code Veronica was to be Resident Evil 3, and Nemesis was to be the side quest or Gaiden game. Contractual obligations with Sony forced the games to be numbered and named as they are today. As far as differences go, there's a slightly censored death animation in the Japanese version versus the US. In the US, blood splatters across the screen and you get to watch as the enemies that killed you feast upon your corpse. Whereas in Japan, no blood splats across the screen and it slowly fades out as the feeding starts. The Japanese version is also easier than the US version, which was apparently due to the fact that video game rentals are legal in the US but not in Japan. The thought process was that increased difficulty would prevent renters from beating the game in a limited time, and many have argued that the relatively difficult initial run on the streets is designed to discourage short-term players. This version was an impressive release for the time, and in early 1998, Resident Evil fans were taken aback by the original release. There were a few secrets, such as the ability to kill Brad Vickers, the helicopter pilot from the first game, near the beginning and unlock second costumes. You could also find a hidden photo of Rebecca Chambers on a desk in the STARS office, and of course there's the 2 fingerprint door in the lab. The true release for which all other versions are based on, however, came 6 months later with the DualShock release, also on the PlayStation 1. The original PS1 release hit store shelves in January 1998 for both Japan and the US, but the DualShock release that came in August and November respectively is considered the definitive version. I remember at the time thinking it was mildly tweaked to support the vibration feedback and the newly released DualShock controller, but it turns out there's more going on behind the scenes than simply rumble and analog controls. For those picking these titles up on PSN, it's important to note that the Japanese PSN release is the original version, whereas the US release is the DualShock version. Let's take a look at what has been changed. Obviously, the first notable change is the inclusion of rumble support, and the left analog stick works to substitute the D-pad. From there, the main menu has changed slightly, introducing a new arrange mode that acts almost like a tutorial and reduces difficulty, damage taken, and even gives you an SMG with infinite ammo to run through the game. You also get a rocket launcher and chain gun, both with unlimited ammo, that are stored in your item boxes. In order to get an A rank in arrange, however, you have to beat the game with only the pistol, the 120 bullets found throughout the campaign, and the knife without saving. That's some feat. In addition, the Japanese DualShock release contains a USA mode that features the higher difficulty from the North American release. You also have 2 different areas to save and load games from, depending on whether or not you played arrange mode or normal mode. Besides these menu items, there are no changes to the actual game campaign. However, new modes do unlock as you complete the game more and more. Beating Scenario B will allow you to create a new save game for arrange mode that is in all question marks. When you load this save in arrange mode, you will discover a new mode called Extreme Battle. In this minigame, you are tasked with finding and defusing a series of bombs scattered throughout the locations of the game. You are given an initial offering of weapons, ammo, and healing items that you take on your journey, and there are pickups including ink ribbons in the environment. There are 3 levels of difficulty. Each new level reduces the amount of ink ribbons and adds bigger enemies including the infamous Mr. X and of course, William Birkin. You can select either Leon or Claire for the first level, but Ada Wong unlocks after you complete level 1, and Chris Redfield from the first game unlocks after the completion of level 2. Beating the entire 3-level scenario results in a single shot of Raccoon City in the morning, and a different epilogue comes up in type. Another unlockable mode is Fourth Survivor, which you can access after beating both scenarios with both characters, at least one of which has an A ranking and all of which have a B ranking. Fourth Survivor features Hunk, an agent of Umbrella that is seen being attacked by Birkin in the sewers. In Fourth Survivor, Hunk has a large chunk of health, as well as a loadout of weapons and healing. Your task is to navigate the sewers and get to the helicopter with the G-Virus now in your possession. Finally, there is the joke minigame, The Tofu Survivor, that is unlocked after completing the game 6 times, including both scenarios for both characters, and at least one receiving an A rank. This is a recreation of Fourth Survivor that features a large chunk of tofu as the protagonist, and he's provided with only a knife as well as 2 green herbs and 1 blue herb to complete this already difficult mission. To somewhat balance this mode, Tofu can take more damage than anyone else, and he doesn't limp until poisoned or in danger status. He also changes colors as his status changes. He's a very Japanese edition with his own sound effects and even screaming in Japanese when hurt, even though you're playing the American version. If you somehow complete this mode, the ranking screen depicts Hunk eating the piece of tofu, proving that your efforts were all for naught. You'll have to excuse me for having to use the GameCube version to show off Fourth Survivor and Tofu Survivor, but the reality is I was not able to meet the completion requirements for unlocking this game. But luckily, a used memory card that came with my GameCube copy already had these modes unlocked. It's a difficult task to unlock and an even more difficult task to complete these somewhat hidden modes. As you can see, there were a lot of additions packed into the holiday season DualShock release of the game, and many consider it to be the real release of Resident Evil 2, whereas the original release was clearly the incomplete version that was rushed to market. All other ports of the game appear to be based on this version. The next release to come out in 1998 is quite different from all the others in that it was for a portable console, the TigerGame.com, and thus it is a severely modified experience. And now for the biggest anomaly of these releases, the TigerGame.com version. If you are familiar with Tiger Electronics in the least, it was responsible for those LCD dot matrix games in the late 80s and 90s that tried to capture the essence of a console game in a handheld. The result was always a game that did a pretty good job of looking the part, but gameplay that never felt right. The Game.com was Tiger's cart-based handheld, an evolution of sorts because previously all games were sold as standalone units. Much like previous titles, what you get is a game that does a decent job of looking the part, only with little substance. Leon is the only playable character, and he can navigate the playfield in 3 levels of depth, as can his enemies. There were 4 buttons on the Game.com, but for some reason they are all overutilized as you try to push a single button to draw your weapon, and then another to shoot. Yes, I know that's how it works in the other versions of the game, but this is supposed to be a simplified version. Additionally, this game has slow reaction time and Leon navigates very clunky, so the concept of 2 buttons to fire seems completely unnecessary to me. Impressively, this game has all of the locations of the console counterparts, albeit stripped down in shortened versions, as well as the menu inventory and even story-based pickups like logs and journals. As an elevator pitch for a game, it's basically Resident Evil 2 for portables, except that it doesn't play or feel right. I couldn't figure out how to escape a zombie's grasp, and I couldn't move quickly or effectively enough to get much further than a few screens. What you're seeing here is an emulated version since I didn't think there was a good way to capture a handheld LCD game with effective light and clarity. Regardless of whether you play it on the handheld or on the emulator, this is a clunky port that is best forgotten into obscurity than regarded as a lost rare version of Capcom's survival horror franchise on the portables. And now let's quickly move on to more of the home versions. The PC version of Resident Evil 2 released in early 1999 and was a higher resolution port of the DualShock version on PS1. It was entitled Resident Evil 2 Platinum in the US and featured everything from the PS1 version, as well as a data gallery that contained the game's movies, 3D models, photos, and some illustrations. Almost everything is unlocked from the beginning, but the movies unlock as they are seen in the game. Extreme Battle Mode is also unlocked from the start. Completing any scenario in this game also adds a hard mode to the normal mode and a nightmare difficulty to the arrange mode, not found in most other versions. The game can run in either 320 by 240 resolution, which is also found on the PS1 port, or an enhanced 640 by 480 with all the 3D models scaling up in resolution as well. Unfortunately, this port did not feature a complete overhaul of the game, so the backgrounds are still in their original low-resolution format, as are the cutscenes, which suffered compression in addition to the lower resolution. It can look funny given that this title featured 3D models on a flat, plain background, so the characters seem to pop with higher resolution and even appear to be floating when pasted against the low-res background. I think of either cell-based animation or color forms when I see this game in action. Still, with the higher resolution assets, this game looks better than most versions available for the time, and we were used to console ports having this high-res model with low-res background effect. If you wish to play this today, the effects can be varied and random. Installation is pretty easy thanks to this website dedicated to playing older games that features hybrid installation and patching executable. It will literally rip all of the content off both discs, store them on the hard drive, patch the game, and provide alternative .exe files for running each of the game's 2 discs. It should be noted that you do need the original discs of the game, or at least an ISO loaded into Dameware, to run it. You'll also want to change the properties of all 3 executables to run in Windows 95 compatibility mode, But that doesn't mean your troubles are over. On Radeon cards with newer than 2013 drivers, the game simply will not load and a dialog box that reads, "Failed to initialize DirectX." If you wish to play on a Radeon card, it's my understanding that you have to roll back to earlier 2012 firmware that can cause all kinds of issues with other games in your system, which is not advised. On other graphics processors, the game will hopefully load, and it should be in the full screen version of the 320 by 240 mode. If you attempt to alter the config file and change the resolution, the game will most likely run in a small box at a fast speed. You can also tweak the config file if you have trouble running the game with a non-Radeon card. Once the game is loaded, it will perform pretty well. However, random flickers will be present, but they don't seem to alter the game performance. There's also a massive save bug that can render the game unable to save when you get to the first typewriter in the police station. If you get this bug, you will have to restart the game and go through the unskippable opening cutscene and run through the streets all over again. I never had this bug happen, but many say it's happened dozens of times for them. Since I was unable to replicate the problem, I'm not sure whether or not the bug can even happen randomly after this initial save is created. Given all the hiccups and headaches associated with this version, I can't recommend playing it, especially with emulation on the PS1 being available and having a similar look at an even better graphical upresing. If you do, though, good luck. Now, let's move on to the most unique version of all, the Nintendo 64 port. The fact that this came out on N64 is nothing shy of a miracle. The massive over 1 gigabyte game of Resident Evil 2 that took up 2 discs on almost every release is compacted down to a single 64 megabyte cartridge and sacrifices almost nothing in the process. Sure, the cutscenes have heavy video and audio compression, resulting in a blurry mess not unlike most N64 games, and fuzzy sound during cutscene dialogue. There's also a specific cutscene in the game, the one where either Claire or Ada are talking to Annette Birkin, that is merged. In all other versions, you hear Claire's voice if playing in her scenario and Ada's voice if playing in Leon's scenario.
Are you telling me that he injected the G-virus into his own body?
The G-virus has the ability to revitalize cellular functions.
But other than a few random lines, the cutscene itself is unchanged. In the N64 version, the Claire cutscene is used for both scenarios, resulting in you randomly hearing Claire's voice during a scene in which she's supposedly not there and Ada is present.
Are you telling me that he injected the G-virus into his own body?
The G-virus has the ability to revitalize cellular functions.
This is a minor detail, and it's surely a decision designed to shrink down the size of the game, but considering everything else is in there, including both scenarios and extra content, it's nonetheless an impressive downsizing. Graphically, the game looks like the PS1 version, although I think it may look a little better with the enhanced RAM pack graphics you see here, and of course it's rendered in 640 by 480 mode. The sound compression isn't very noticeable in-game either. There are a couple of subtle differences. For starters, the violence, while it can be tuned up and completely the same as the PlayStation 1 version, there is a variance there. You can completely pull the violence away by setting the violence to low, and when you do that, it's a little more akin to the original Japanese PS1 version, especially when you die. In addition, you can change the blood, so I've had some fun with it. You see some red, some blue, some green. Also, there are no load times, although the door animations still happen, so when you put them side by side, you realize that it doesn't really change much on that load time. There is also a new combination to the safe in the beginning. Normally, in every other version, the combination is 2236, so people who've run through the game multiple times will easily be able to jump into it and just open the safe. This time around, it can differ. In this case, my new combination is 4542, but I've heard of other variances as well. You also do not have the ability to delete your save, so the same 15 save files are used concurrently and just need to be overwritten. Again, I don't think this is that big of a deal. I've heard others claim that that's very frustrating because you can't basically make the cart your own or act like it's your fresh cart. But Capcom's done this a couple of different times with different Resident Evil games, so it doesn't change too much for me. Force Survivor and Tofu Survivor are also in this version, although Extreme Battle was removed. And best of all, they can be unlocked through button codes at the main menu, which shaves the huge chore of the normal way to unlock these modes out of the picture. As for what's different, the menu does have a few extra options not found elsewhere. After completing the game, there is an item randomizer mode that moves around all non-key items to random locations. This results in a playthrough that could be somewhat similar to the original experience or create a unique feast or famine dynamic as herbs all appear together or ammo shows in abundance. That's all good and well until you reach the end and realize that the carefully placed balance of items is thrown out of whack and you may be out of the necessary bullets or healing items you need to complete the game. The final change is probably the most interesting in the form of the EX files. These are 16 files scattered about in scenarios A and B that have background information for the later released Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and Resident Evil 0. While there may have been development plans for all these games to come to Nintendo 64, and we know from Capcom that at least Resident Evil 0 was in development for the N64 at the time of the title's release, it's a somewhat puzzling inclusion. Even more strange is the fact that the EX files don't show up in any other version of Resident Evil 2, including the Dreamcast that saw releases of both Resident Evil 3 and Code Veronica, as well as the GameCube that was not only a Nintendo console, but also saw releases of every game mentioned in the EX files. Either way, for collectors and Resident Evil lore completionists, the inclusion of the EX files makes the N64 version of the game a must-have. For everyone else, the text of the EX files is readily available in several wikis online. The next version to be released was the Dreamcast version in early 2000. The Dreamcast version of Resident Evil 2 was known as Resident Evil 2 Value Plus in Japan and probably meant to bring as many of the Resident Evil games over to the Sega console with the upcoming release of Code Veronica on the Dreamcast. I probably feel this way because the Japanese port included a demo of Code Veronica as well. This version is almost an exact duplicate of the PC version for Windows 98, which makes perfect sense considering the Dreamcast runs the Windows CE operating system. It was capable of delivering the graphical fidelity of the PC game in every way, especially with the VGA port, and had the hardware to run it effectively. Compared to the performance and graphics of the PC version, I would say it holds up as a fantastic port. The high-resolution 3D models do look goofy on the low-res backgrounds, just like in the PC version, and the cutscenes look extremely downsampled and low-resolution as well. The only thing I cannot figure out is whether or not the game is running in a native 320 by 240 and upscaled by the VGA box, or if it's running a native 640 by 480 or 480p running directly out of the box. The footage you see here was captured directly out of the VGA box, but since the PC version had both resolutions and I was unable to accurately run it in 640 by 480, I cannot tell for sure what the Dreamcast is doing. The game is still confined to 2 discs as well, which meant that the high capacity of the GD-ROM at 1.2 gigabytes was still too small to hold all of the assets of the PC version. This again speaks to the impressive efforts of packing the N64 version into a mere 64 megabytes. Either way, it looks great and stands as probably the best version of the game that was available around the time of its release. The one difference in this version is both novel and helpful, which involves the use of the VMU. On the Dreamcast, the Visual Memory Unit, or VMU for short, which is the memory card that plugged into the controller for saving, displays your ammo and health. This removed the need to pause the game and check how many bullets you had left in the clip, or how your health was doing, both common reasons to enter the menu at any playthrough for Resident Evil 2. While it didn't have a quick way to heal or reload your gun, and despite the fact that your character physically limps when injured, this was a helpful status screen that you could glance down at instead of accessing your inventory. A small addition, but one that definitely sets this port apart. At this point, it would appear that the Resident Evil ports were done, until an agreement saw the release of every major Resident Evil game on the GameCube. It is here that the most enhanced port available releases. Releasing in 2003 and somewhat rare today, probably due to the budget price and low print run, the GameCube version is probably the definitive version to play this game. If not only because it makes tweaks that modern gamers appreciate, but also because it's the most friendly controller outside of the original PlayStation. Graphically, this is the version of the game that has increased resolution and detail of the backgrounds as well as the 3D models, making it look more cohesive than the cell animation effect of the PC and Dreamcast ports. Cutscenes look to have little or no compression as well, perhaps retaining the original 640 by 480 resolution they were created in, but there is some debate online as to whether or not this is the case. Either way, it's clearly rendered in 480p and ready to be enjoyed in the resolution by anyone who has component cables on the GameCube or the Wii. The game is also consolidated into a single 1.5 gigabyte GameCube disc, so there's no longer a need to swap discs when changing characters. In the GameCube version, you simply swap the protagonist in the options screen of the main menu. Oddly enough, the voice that says Resident Evil 2 on the main screen is different from the other versions, completely re-recorded for this port. Unfortunately, the aforementioned EX files do not make a comeback in this version of the game, which is both ironic and sad considering all of the games referenced in those files were released on the GameCube. I would think that at least a fan patch would put them back in, but it would appear that does not exist. Some say the biggest reason was due to the shaky relations between Sony and Capcom at this time, and the unsure nature of the future of Resident Evil on future Sony consoles. Another odd change is that the end credits from Scenario B plays back various cutscenes as opposed to the black background. The song, which will be heard in our comparison section, as well as the contents of the credits still remain the same. All in all, this port is a slightly tweaked version that pretty much stands as the definitive way to play Resident Evil 2. It's entirely possible that if you don't have a GameCube, Wii, or a copy of this game available, you're probably best off picking up the $6 PSN version for the PS3, PSP, and Vita. But if you do have the ability to play this version, it's definitely worthwhile. The GameCube port represents the best balance of solid controls, great graphics, and an enjoyable experience originally found in the DualShock PS1 version. Wait! Before you go, there are two more versions of Resident Evil 2 that you may not be aware of, so let's take a quick look at those. We'll start off with the 2006 SourceNext version. SourceNext was the software company responsible for the PC ports of the first three games back in the late 90s. For some reason in 2006, the company released a port of Resident Evil 2 in Japan only, the game is known as Biohazard 2 over there, for the Windows XP platform. It was intended to be a more compatible release for those that were trying to get the game to run on PC, most of which were speedrunners. This version of the game is somewhat bare bones when it comes to the options and settings normally found in PC releases of the time. It doesn't even have a config file you set up. What it does contain is a full 640 by 480 version of the game, with graphics that look as good, if not better than the GameCube port, as well as the only confirmed instance of the full uncompressed cutscenes. The game is somewhat unstable despite these upgrades, and there is an official 1.10 patch that is recommended if trying to run the game. It appears to be the most compatible with NVIDIA cards, running in either Windows XP or Windows 7 in XP compatibility mode. This version, while it may be viewed as the best version and definitely the version of choice for speedrunners, has several issues to me. The first, and probably the deal breaker, is that you can't run it stably in full screen. If I'm playing a game in a small window on an already small screen, I don't see the point. Secondly, it's all in Japanese, which I honestly don't mind, but I know many will take issue with. Yes, you can get it to run in English, but that involves not one, but two translation patches, and all of the locations of these patches are on sites and in packages that my antivirus, anti-exploit, and anti-malware programs go crazy with warnings. Nope, there's no way I'd jack with these English patches today. On top of all that, there's almost no way to get your hands on this game outside of piracy. I'm not quite the anti-piracy crusader I was 5 years ago when I established GH101, but Capcom has made Resident Evil 2 really easy to purchase and play nowadays, and I feel pirating this Japanese port is a combination of laziness and opportunism. I know some of you won't agree, and trust me, I'm not criticizing your opinion. I'm just saying that this fact alone is just another factor as to why I don't much care for Biohazard 2 SourceNext. I still stand that the GameCube is the best version for today's gamer. Finally, there was one more version, which was never released, and that's the Game Boy Advance demo developed by Raylight, although never authorized by Capcom, from the early 2000s. Now, the final version I want to talk about is the Game Boy Advance version of Resident Evil 2, which is barely really considered a version of Resident Evil 2 that technically released from Raylight Studios. In this quote-unquote prototype, basically Raylight took an unlicensed, unauthorized version of Resident Evil 2, I'm guessing the N64 version from what I see here, and proved that it could work on the Game Boy Advance. Now this has run some controversy for a couple of different reasons, but first of all, let's take a look at it. The prototype only spans the opening cutscene as well as a run with Leon run through the streets that completely bypasses the gun shop and basically allows you to get almost to the Raccoon City Police Department. Along the way, you'll see a lot of reused locales. I think they actually took the low-res backgrounds and just put them right into the Game Boy Advance. And you see some very archaic, but still impressively polygonal versions of both the zombies and Leon. Also, if you look, the opening cutscene does have all the audio. Again, that's probably due to the amazing compression done on the N64 version. And you do hear the gunshots, Leon sounding hurt, the zombies moaning, the squishy sounds. You know, here's an example, but here's all the sound effects. But aside from that, the game is barely playable. I mean, Leon moves at a snail's pace, which is probably what you would expect and not something we haven't seen from other versions on portable consoles. But also, it's just wonky. Sometimes the shots with the zombies don't line up properly, and then it ends very abruptly. It's at this point I should probably point out that, again, this game was never going to come out, but there are some very obvious indications that this game could never have been actually ported to the Game Boy Advance. The first one being that when you put this ROM onto a flash cart, it simply doesn't work. I've seen videos online where it claims to work, but all this was, in my opinion, is somebody who took the flash cart that has the media player, they ran through it on the computer like I've done here, then ran the media player onto the actual hardware, which you can totally do, and then pretended to be playing the game. And if you do enough memorization, you can do it. The reason for this is if you look on countless internet forums, nobody's been able to get this ROM to work properly, and I've tried 6 different versions of the ROM, and every single one of those versions doesn't work on actual hardware and works just fine in emulators. So I'm pretty sure it's all the same ROM. Also, this game is almost 3 megabytes, and for clarity, most games on the Game Boy Advance was about 3 to 6 megabytes. If 3 megabytes is only one walk down an alleyway, imagine the entire game plus all the cutscenes plus all the modes. There is no way this would have ever fit on a Game Boy Advance cart. So while it's really cool to see and a fun little prototype to throw in a video here, frankly, the Game Boy Advance was never going to get a version of Resident Evil 2, not even this version that Raylight created. So that's it for the many versions of Resident Evil 2, one of the most beloved entries in the series. I covered this game because it's not only popular and ported to several consoles, but because it's a great showpiece for the Capcom PC/Dreamcast ports of the PS1 games. In short, that basically means I don't have to do any other ports like Resident Evil 3 or Dino Crisis. Since I know many of you come to version for side-by-side comparisons, I'll close this video with several comparison shots and even some emulation shots for those interested in seeing the impressive ways in which modern software cleans up these retro games. Until next time, this is Fred Rojas saying, peace out.